Sterling Maddox had never been the type to make assumptions without evidence, but the slow, insidious trickle of missing items from his home had made him a man on edge. It started innocently enough, a spoon here, a few coins there. But over the past few months, his suspicions had grown until they finally reached the one person who had access to every corner of his home, his maid, Cora Whitmore. The sun blazed mercilessly outside the ranch house, casting a harsh golden glow on the kitchen. Inside, Sterling stood in the study, his steel gray eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed through the heavy curtains on Cora's every move. His hands clenched around the edge of his desk as he watched her scrub the kitchen floor with an air of mechanical precision. Cora's thin frame hunched as she worked, her worn dress clinging to her as she moved about the kitchen with a silent, almost robotic focus. The small tendrils of her brown hair, usually bound tightly in a knot at the back of her head, had begun to fall loose, damp with sweat as the heat pressed down. Sterling's jaw tightened as he observed her. There was something almost suspiciously efficient about the way she worked, too efficient perhaps. For 3 months, Sterling had been noticing things going missing from his home, and though it started with insignificant objects, the items he'd been losing had been steadily increasing in value. First, a silver spoon disappeared, followed by a bottle of expensive whiskey and then coins from his desk. The pattern was clear. The thefts weren't accidental. He watched her cautiously, observing the way she moved and the way she interacted with him. She never seemed to meet his eyes. She was polite but distant, hurried in her tasks, avoiding any unnecessary conversation. And then there was the way she pocketed her wages, slipping them into her apron without a single word of gratitude or acknowledgement. Sterling's mind went immediately to the most obvious explanation. Cora was the only one with access to every room of his house. She was, by all accounts, the perfect candidate for a thief. But as the days passed, Sterling's suspicions only deepened, and today he'd had enough. He'd come to a decision that would finally confirm whether Cora was guilty of the crimes he'd been silently accusing her of. He would follow her. He would discover where she was going and what she was doing with the money he had been paying her. Cora gathered her cleaning supplies and moved toward the door, her weary movements betraying her exhaustion. She paused, glancing briefly toward Sterling's study window, as though sensing his gaze on her, before stepping out into the blistering heat of the afternoon. Sterling waited a full 30 seconds before following her lead. His boots clicked against the polished wood floors as he moved with careful precision, donning his wide-brimmed hat and stepping out through the back door. Outside, his horse was waiting in the stable, and as he mounted the powerful chestnut stallion, he noticed Cora's figure growing smaller and smaller as she walked away down the dusty path. Sterling kept his distance, riding low behind the rocks and trees that littered the landscape to avoid being noticed. He followed Cora for miles, his eyes fixed on her every movement, wondering where she was heading. She wasn't walking in the direction of the town where the other servants lived. No, she took a different path, one that led to a desolate part of the outskirts of town, a place Sterling knew all too well but had no reason to go himself. Sterling's gut twisted with suspicion. What business could she possibly have in that area? The only structures out that way were long-abandoned buildings, remnants of the past that no one bothered to maintain anymore. Something didn't sit right with him. The further they went, the more disoriented he became. The land surrounding them was dry and barren, the terrain stretching endlessly with nothing but silence and dust. As they crested a small hill, Sterling saw Cora's destination, an old wooden structure that looked more like a rotting shack than a home. Paint was peeling from the walls and the roof seemed to sag dangerously in places. Sterling's heart beat faster as he realized where she was heading. He dismounted his horse and tied it to a nearby tree, taking care to stay out of sight. Cora disappeared inside the ramshackle building, and that's when Sterling heard it. Voices, muffled but clear. Children's voices, calling out eagerly for someone. His heart clenched when he heard the name. Miss Cora, Miss Cora's back. Sterling pressed his back against the side of the building, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. He peered through a crack in the weathered wood and saw the impossible. 6 children, all ages ranging from 5 to 12, were clustered around Cora. Their clothes were patched, their faces thin but bright with joy at her return. But it was what happened next that stopped Sterling in his tracks. Cora reached into her worn cloth bag and pulled out several items, food. Not stolen goods to sell, but bread, apples, and preserves, all from his own kitchen, his pantry. The very food he thought she'd been taking without permission. But it wasn't stolen. It was given. Cora's face softened, her tired, hardened features transforming as she smiled down at the children, her face filled with tenderness and love. She knelt down to their level, offering them what little she had with the same selflessness that a mother would. Sterling's stomach twisted with a mixture of shame and confusion as he watched her hand out the food to the hungry children, a sick realization slowly taking root. "Did you bring medicine for Tommy?" a young boy asked, his face full of concern. Cora nodded and pulled out a small bottle from her bag, holding it out to a sickly boy who lay on a makeshift bed in the corner of the room. Sterling watched in disbelief as she carefully administered the medicine, her movements soft and loving, a stark contrast to the cold suspicion he had always felt about her. Sterling couldn't help but watch in stunned silence as Cora gave what little money she had left to Marcus, a boy who seemed to have taken on the role of caretaker for the others. "The rent man came by again today," Marcus said in a voice full of worry. "If we don't have the money by the week's end." Cora's face sagged with fatigue, but she forced a smile, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "Don't you worry about that now, Marcus. We'll figure something out." Sterling stood frozen, heart heavy as he watched her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman he'd so harshly judged with the person he was seeing now. This wasn't the thief he'd assumed her to be. This was a woman sacrificing everything she had to care for these children, offering up her wages and any scrap of food she could find. She wasn't stealing from him. She was giving away everything she had to protect those who had nothing. As she sat beside the sick boy, Tommy, and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, Sterling felt a sharp pang in his chest. Cora, this woman he had despised, was doing the most noble thing he had ever witnessed. The silver locket he had been frantic to find, the one he thought had been stolen, was not being sold. It was being used as a symbol of comfort and hope for these children who had no one else. Sterling's entire world view shifted in that moment. This woman, who had once been nothing more than a mere servant to him, was a woman of extraordinary courage, of fierce love for the children who depended on her. And in that instant, Sterling Maddox realized that the things he had once thought to be true were nothing but lies. Sterling Maddox had never expected his life to change in such an unexpected way. But as he stood there, watching Cora with those children, the truth finally began to sink in. His anger, his suspicion, his accusations, all of it had been based on a lie. The woman he had wronged for so long had not stolen from him. Instead, she had been offering everything she had to save the lives of 6 abandoned, forgotten children. As Cora stood up, the weight of her actions beginning to settle on her shoulders, she glanced out the small window of the room, her face tightening. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, the shadows stretching long across the ground. Sterling could see that she was worn down, physically and emotionally exhausted, but her love for these children, her desire to keep them safe, burned brighter than anything else. She moved around the room with practiced grace, preparing a small meal from the meager supplies she had managed to gather. Even in the harshest of circumstances, she was determined to care for them, to make their lives just a little more bearable. Sterling remained hidden, watching from his place outside, his heart twisted with shame and guilt. He had spent so long judging her, assuming the worst, when in reality, she had been nothing but selfless. The reality was far different than the picture he had painted in his mind. Through the gap in the wall, Sterling watched as Cora knelt beside each child, whispering words of comfort to them, smoothing their hair, offering small gestures of care that, in the grand scheme of things, meant the world to these children. And then there was Tommy, the young boy who had been sick for days. His pale face had been a source of constant worry for Cora, and now, as she tenderly held his hand, whispering soothing words, Sterling couldn't help but wonder how many other sacrifices she had made over the years. It was when she reached for her bag again, pulling out a small silver item that made Sterling's heart stop, his mother's locket, the one he had been searching for, thinking it had been stolen. But instead of keeping it, instead of selling it, Cora held it up in the soft candlelight, speaking to it with the kind of reverence he had never seen before. "This belonged to a lady who was very kind to me once," Cora said softly, her voice breaking as she addressed the children. "She told me that sometimes when we're scared or lonely, we can hold something beautiful and remember that there's still good in the world." Sterling's breath caught in his throat. The locket, his mother's cherished locket, was being used exactly the way his mother had wanted it to be used, to bring comfort and hope. Sterling stood there, heart racing, as he watched Cora give the locket to Tommy, telling him to hold on to it that night, to let it remind him that he was loved. He had been wrong about so many things. Cora had never been a thief. She had been a lifeline for these children, a source of hope when they had none. And yet, Sterling still didn't understand the full extent of the connection between Cora and these children. It wasn't until Tommy, the youngest, spoke again that the last piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. "The rent man came by again today," Tommy said weakly. "He said if we don't have the money by the week's end—" Sterling's blood ran cold as the words hit him like a blow. Rent? A rent man? A chill ran down his spine as he thought about the people who preyed on those with nothing, taking advantage of their desperation. Cora's face tightened as she heard Tommy's words, but she didn't break down. Instead, she gave him a smile and patted his head. "Don't you worry about that now, Tommy. We'll figure something out." Sterling couldn't stand it any longer. The woman he had misunderstood, the woman he had watched with disdain, had been doing everything she could to help these children. And now, in his moment of reckoning, Sterling knew that he couldn't stand by and let this continue. As Cora moved to check on the other children, Sterling's heart was pounding. He had seen enough. He had judged her for far too long, and it was time to make things right. But just as Cora turned to leave the room, her face drained of color, and she staggered on her feet, clutching her chest. Sterling's instincts kicked in, and before he could think, he rushed into the room. "Cora!" he shouted, but she didn't hear him. She swayed dangerously on her feet, her eyes glazing over with pain. Sterling caught her before she collapsed, holding her fragile body in his arms. "What's happening to you?" he demanded, his voice thick with concern. "I'm fine, Mr. Maddox," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been fine." "No, you're not fine," Sterling said, his anger and concern growing. He realized with a sickening twist in his gut that Cora had been hiding her illness all along. Her frail body was a result of the sacrifices she had made for these children. Every ounce of strength she had left was being drained, not just from her own exhaustion, but from the weight of the responsibility she carried. She had been too proud, too honorable to ask for help. "You're dying," Sterling said softly, his voice breaking. Cora tried to smile, but it was weak, filled with sorrow. "I'm doing what I can. I can't leave them. They need me." Sterling's heart shattered. All these years he had assumed she was a thief, a liar, when in reality she had been living a life of sacrifice, one that would leave her with nothing. And now, as she stood in front of him, her body failing, Sterling realized the truth. She had given everything for these children. "Please, Cora, let me help you," Sterling begged, his voice cracking. But Cora shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I've made too many mistakes, Mr. Maddox. I don't deserve help. Sterling knelt beside her, his heart heavy with regret. You've done nothing but give, and now it's my turn to give back. But Cora's next words stopped him in his tracks. I can't take it. I've promised them. I promised I would keep them safe no matter what. I couldn't live with myself if I failed. Sterling stood up, determination flooding his veins. He couldn't allow this woman who had given so much to suffer like this. He had made a terrible mistake in judgment, but now he had a chance to fix it. Don't worry, Cora, he said quietly. You've kept your promises, and now I'm going to keep mine.